However, whilst there were 1 to 1.25 million Europeans who were brought to Africa as slaves, it pales in comparison to the 12 million Africans who were brought to the Americas as slaves between the 16th and 19th century. And this is what's known as the transatlantic slave trade, or as it's also known, the triangular slave trade. So this is where, people were transported from Africa to the Americas. And of those 12 million, about 3.26 million slaves, were brought over by the British Empire. And obviously, predominantly, these people went to the Caribbean. About 90% of them were exported to the Caribbean. However, it's kind of hypocritical, because if you look at this, it's like, okay, England's always focused on, liberty and stuff, right? It's always been the land of hope and glory, mother of the free. And this idea of liberty really is in stark contrast, to the practice of slavery, of course. And what's ironic as well is that within England itself, there's a long legal precedent for slavery being banned in England, right? So going all the way back to 1569, there was a slave who had been brought over from Russia to England, and it was determined in a court decision back then that they weren't allowed to enter, right? Because, and this is the quote, "England was too pure an air for slaves to breathe in." So that kind of gives you an idea, right? So it's fine for slaves to be in other places, but in England itself, as soon as the slave gets there, the air is too pure for them to breathe in, right? Which means that slavery as an institution cannot exist within England itself. Now, fast forward all the way to 1701, and there was another court decision, so the Lord Chief Justice then, he upheld the decision, which basically said that upon a slave entering England, they immediately became free, right? So this kind of building on from the case before. So before it's saying slaves can't enter, now it's saying if a slave does enter, as soon as they touch English soil, they're now free. Now this decision was repealed in 1729 by a later court decision. However, in 1763, there was another decision, in which the original ruling was reinstated. And in 1772, this is when you had the famous Somerset versus Stuart case, right? So obviously, when I was doing research for this, obviously, read lots of things and stuff, but also try and look at different YouTubers, to give their kind of take on things. And lo and behold, who do I find who's done a video on this? But my good friend, Juarez Lee Shelton, MA. So he's a mobile historian, he's a blue-collar scholar, as he calls himself. And if you want any kind of research to do with any kind of court decision, whether it's the Supreme Court in America or any kind of thing like that, he's your man to go to and stuff, right? He knows everything, right? Everything. So definitely check him out, subscribe to his channel, like his videos, etc., etc. Much love to him, right? So within the Somerset versus Stuart case, so you had Somerset, who was a slave from the colony of Massachusetts, and he had been brought over to England by his master, who was Stuart. So what happened is that Stuart wanted to, re-enslave him, right? He wanted to sell him, not in Massachusetts, but he wanted to sell him to Jamaica. So what was determined in that court decision in 1772 by Lord Mansfield was that, again, it's this upholding of the previous decision, which is that England's air is too pure for a slave to breathe in. So this obviously, like you said, is a huge hypocrisy, because at the time, this is when the slave trade within the British Empire actually was ramping up. So first off, the massive thing to kind of say is that the transatlantic slave trade, actually, it didn't just continue after the decision, it actually ramped up. So between 1775 and 1807, right, /1808, so this is when the slave trade ended, first of all, respectively, for the British Empire, and then the year after with the American colonies, right? So within this period here, roughly 1.2 to 1.4 million slaves were transported by the British Empire / the Americans, right, to the Americas. So, obviously the vast majority of these went to the Caribbean, but as a whole, about 40% of the total slaves which the British Empire brought over to the Americas came in this period, right? So this kind of gives you an idea of just how much the scale was. Actually, it kind of ramped up. And actually, when it comes to the United States, it ramped up at an even faster rate. So paradoxically, what ended up happening is that just at the moment when, you can see an end to the slave trade, this is when the slavers decide, right, okay, this is when, eventually this practice is going to be made illegal. Let's get as many slaves in as possible, and while we still can. So now we're going to be looking at 4 different things, right? We're going to be looking at the societal impact of this decision. We're going to look at the economic impact of the decision. We're going to look at the cultural impact. And also we're going to be looking at the impact on the transatlantic slave trade in its entirety, right? As a result of this decision being made. So buckle up, and now we're going to dive straight in. So talking about the societal impact of it, right? Paradoxically, this decision had a huge impact on the American war for independence and like the whole movement for independence. And it affected the different colonies in very different ways, but it still had the same overarching effect. So in northern colonies, which tended to be more pro-abolition, which had less slaves, right? They saw the decision as a thing that really spurred the abolition movement. So they was like, okay, one of the reasons why we want independence, right? So obviously this is a contributing factor. I'm not saying it's a major factor, but one of the contributing factors was actually the decision doesn't go far enough, right? So we want it to be a thing where, you know, if you have a law in England which says that it's not good enough to have slaves in England, we also want that same thing in the American colonies, right? So they want to go at a much faster pace than the British Empire would allow them. Paradoxically, many of the Southerners, right, so many of the founding fathers, in particular from Virginia, you know, they owned slaves. And for them, they saw the writing on the wall, right? So many people in the South wanted to split away from the British Empire. And one of the contributing factors to that was because of this decision. So they saw, okay, eventually they're going to, you know, the Brits are going to try and like get rid of the institution of slavery for us, right? So we're going to rise up in order to make sure that that doesn't happen. So obviously this is why, like we said in the previous video, right? This is why the British Empire ended slavery as a practice in the 1830s, and the United States had to fight a civil war for the practice to be ended in the 1860s, right? So what we can imagine in this timeline is actually, you know, if the decision had been made that the practice of the slave trade is going to be ended not in 1807, but right now in 1772, I think that this would have really spurred on the American Revolution. And I think that instead of the war for independence starting in 1775, it might have started in 1772, right? So these are kind of things to consider when we talk about the societal impact. Talking now about the economic impact. So slavery, depending on what source you read, right, contributed in the early 19th century to between 5 and 11% of the British economy, right? So obviously the higher end things are saying 11, let's for argument's sake say it's 11%. This still means, of course, that the other 89% of the British economy was not based on this. So like we said in previous videos in terms of, you know, the kind of narrative that Britain's wealth is based on slavery. Okay, well, first of all, the other 89% of it is not based on slavery in those days. And then furthermore, if you fast forward and stuff, if you look at countries like Germany, which never had any colonies or any slaves, or if you look at landlocked Switzerland, which obviously had no colonies and had no slaves, they're much wealthier than Britain. So, you know, the whole kind of argument of, you know, the wealth of Britain being based off of slavery and colonies and stuff is complete nonsense. And the same thing with the United States. You know, obviously a lot of US exports, like all the way up until 1860, was heavily dependent on the sale of cotton and also on tobacco and other products which were made by slaves. However, what we have to bear in mind is that, first of all, slavery focused primarily on the production of luxury items, things like coffee, things like tobacco, things like sugar, right? So it didn't actually really benefit people, right? So you can live without these things. You can live without cotton even, right? So that's the kind of thing to kind of bear in mind. First of all, it produced luxury items which primarily only the rich really benefited from. Obviously, it kind of trickled down eventually to like the lower classes. But there's that. And then there's the second thing, which is that it's not as if we still don't have coffee and sugar and tobacco and all these things and, you know, and cotton, etc., being produced after the period of slavery. So the kind of argument that you needed to have slaves in order to make these things, history has proven that that was obviously a complete nonsense, right? So there was a bit of a dip in like the prices of things, right? There was a dip in the level of production, but these things were still made, right? It was just slightly higher cost because now you had to actually pay the former slaves, whereas before they were free labor. So these are the kind of things to kind of bear in mind in terms of the economic impact and stuff, right? How greatly would Britain or America have been impacted by this? Some people would have lost out. Some elite people would have lost out. the vast majority of the British and American economy still would have trundled on. It still would have been great and stuff. And also we have to bear in mind is that the Industrial Revolution, which was picking up during this time and onwards, moved the economy further and further away from this agrarian focus, right? So further away from agricultural products, right? And more onto manufactured products. So these are kind of things that we have to bear in mind as well, that, you know, the limited effect that it had on the British and American economy, over time, these things were kind of ironed out anyway, and it's a thing of, you know, you didn't need slaves to have this, right? So ending the slave trade at a much earlier rate wouldn't have really made like Britain or America any poorer, right? You know, so we spoke about the economics now. Now we're going to talk about the cultural impact. So what we have to bear in mind is that, like we said, about 90% of the slaves which the British Empire brought over went to the Caribbean, and the high level of and very intense work that was in the Caribbean, right? So working in sugar mills was infinitely worse than working in cotton plantations in the deep south and stuff, right? So the death rate was just through the roof and stuff, right? So that's why so many slaves had to continually be re-imported. Whereas the extra cost of having slaves in America in a climate where, you know, there's less diseases, there's less kind of people going to die of heat exhaustion, etc., etc. And also as well, it's further away, so it's going to be more costly to transport slaves all the way up to there. So all these things combined means that for the United States, that's why only 10% of the slaves which the British Empire exported went to these American colonies, right? So what we have to bear in mind though is, like we said, so 40% of the slaves who in total went to the British Empire, right, came in this period from 1775 onwards. When it comes to the United States, the figure is much, much higher. So from 1775 all the way up until 1866, 59% roughly of all the slaves who were imported to America came in this period. So there was about 305,000 slaves who were imported to the United States in total throughout all these different centuries. And about 180,000 of them came in this tiny period here. So whereas in the British colonies in the Caribbean, there was either a kind of slight reduction or kind of a stabilization in the number of slaves who were being brought, in the American colonies, it was a vast increase, right? So